Hi, I'm Dr. Ashley Holcomb, and I want to talk today about how trauma can cause more than just PTSD, how healing from trauma may look really different from person to person, and a little bit about why this may be. Now, I recognize that some of you watching this video may have been through a trauma, so I want you to notice if you start to feel overwhelmed or triggered by this conversation, and feel free to pause or watch this video in smaller doses. I also want you to remember that this video is not intended to be a replacement for therapy. It's meant to give you ideas for your healing and to motivate you to seek treatment. When we're talking about trauma, there's a wide variety of events that people can experience as traumatic and therefore a variety of responses. Let's consider the difference between a few examples. So first we have interpersonal versus non-interpersonal trauma. There's a big difference between someone who's been through a car accident and someone who's been through a sexual assault. Both are traumas, but you can imagine that their experiences are going to be pretty different. Next, we have single event traumas versus multiple event traumas. So maybe somebody who saw an instance of community violence versus someone like a police officer or an EMT who experiences violence on a daily basis as part of what they do for work. Next, we have the age of the victim. Again, you can see that there's going to be a difference between how a 4-year-old thinks about trauma, then how a 15-year-old thinks about trauma, then how a 35-year-old thinks about trauma. Put these all together and you can see how there's so many different variations and how a child who grew up in an abusive environment could look very, very different than an adult who's been through a natural disaster. All traumas, but very different. In our current diagnostic manual, which is what therapists use to help us diagnose clients, we organize our thinking around mental illness based on certain sets of symptoms. There's a few problems with this. For one, you can have two people with the exact same diagnosis who look very, very different. And secondly, and this is really important when we're talking about trauma is the cause of the mental illness. It's not the symptom. So sometimes we have people who've been through something very traumatic and they don't qualify for a diagnosis of PTSD. There was a study that came out within the last 5 or 10 years about how child soldiers very often don't end up with PTSD. They've clearly been through something traumatic. And what that means for the therapist is then we have to diagnose them with something like depression or anxiety, or for children, it's often something like oppositional defiant disorder or even ADHD. What we really know is going on is trauma. There's also a lot of research out there about the impacts of developmental, long-term, complex interpersonal trauma, aka children growing up in abusive homes. The research covers everything from behavioral and conduct problems to attachment problems, which is like difficulties forming meaningful relationships that feel safe with other people, emotional problems, attention and cognitive problems, problems with dissociation. That's a pretty complex set of symptoms that we're not going to cover much today, but I can cover in another video, and also physical health symptoms. People who experience even just one adverse childhood experience, like an abusive parent or a parent being incarcerated, are dramatically more likely to develop cancer, heart disease, and to be obese as adults. So then when we see a child and they're diagnosed with ADHD or oppositional defiant disorder, also known as they don't follow rules, it's very tempting to just label them a bad kid. Or when we see someone who's obese and depressed and we think, well, they're just lazy, they need to try harder, when in reality, these could be expressions of trauma. So why am I talking about this? Firstly, for my fellow therapists, as well as for my brothers and sisters out there in the medical care fields and in the education fields, we have to be looking at and assessing for trauma even when the diagnosis doesn't say PTSD. We have to advocate for changes in our diagnostic manual to include things like developmental trauma disorder and other disorders that better fit the experiences of those with complex trauma. If you're a teacher, you may not have the opportunity to know the client's diagnosis or to know the client's history, But when you see an IEP float across your desk that says emotional disturbance and has a behavioral intervention plan attached to it, I want you to consider that they have maybe experienced some kind of trauma and to reframe how you think about that child in that kind of lens. Secondly, for those of you who are watching because of a loved one who's experienced trauma, I want you to see just how complicated trauma can be and let that challenge you to get educated on ways to help your loved one. I also made this video for clients who have been through complex trauma. I hope that watching this video helped you understand some of the terms and the ideas around complex trauma, as well as giving yourself a sense that even if you don't fit the bill of PTSD, that your experience of trauma is not invalid. And you can give yourself some grace if you don't look like a typical trauma patient. I also want you to advocate for yourself to get the kind of treatment you need to help you with complex trauma. If your therapist doesn't know the word complex trauma, you need a new therapist who understands trauma-informed treatment. I know I talked a lot today about problems, but there are a lot of treatments for complex trauma, and there is so much hope for you and for your healing. So don't let another day go by without reaching out for help. Want more information on this topic? Don't forget to check out my other videos. Click below to subscribe so you don't miss any content. And if you're interested in treatment, check out some of the links in my profile for therapy resources in your area.